Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Richard Goldberg, Senior Advisor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Richard, thank you again for joining me.
Absolutely. Great to be back.
You join me about once a month to break down what's happening in the Israel Hamas war since October 7th. And this week was a big week, so let's dive in. At the beginning of the week, President Biden said during an ice cream shop visit in Manhattan that he was hopeful there would be at least a temporary ceasefire come next week. He did walk back those comments after a chaotic scene unfolded in Gaza on Thursday after dozens of Palestinians were killed while waiting for food aid trucks. What's your reaction to all of this, particularly President Biden walking back those comments?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the United States is working very closely with Israel and other parties in the region, including the Egyptians and the Qataris, in speaking to Hamas and trying to broker some sort of a temporary ceasefire that would come alongside continued release of hostages that are being held by Hamas. Remember, more than 100 people are still held hostage in Gaza by Hamas, taken from their families, many of them injured on October 7th, in addition to the 1,200 murdered. This has been something that we've watched for a long time now, over 130 some days of watching this catastrophe. And so I think when the president's talking about a temporary ceasefire, he's talking about those negotiations. But what can happen is people can confuse a call for a ceasefire with pressure on Israel to unilaterally withdraw its forces from Gaza before it has completed its mission of destroying Hamas militarily in Gaza. Obviously, the Israelis right now have their eye on the southernmost city in Gaza called Rafah. That is the border of Egypt in Gaza. It's where we assess Hamas leaders have fallen back as their last stand. Many of the terrorist leaders are underground, of course, in between Khan Yunis, which is to the north of Rafah, and Rafah itself. But a lot of the fighters are likely above ground in Rafah as well. So the showdown right now is whether Israel, when Israel, will go into Rafah in a much more expanded way to dismantle Hamas infrastructure there, how they will handle the relationship with the Egyptians along that border. The control of that border will be an important question. And whether or not there will be a ceasefire, how long that ceasefire will be to allow for more hostages to be exchanged potentially for prisoners. That hostage negotiation complex, we can talk about it. I'm hopeful the president doesn't put pressure publicly on Israel to do things before it's in the best interest for Israel security-wise. But I think the Israelis are serious that they are willing to do a temporary ceasefire as long as it is temporary and delivers more hostages.
Do you think the hostage factor of this story is getting lost in the international conversation? Because we do constantly hear temporary ceasefire, but always the caveat of with the release of at least some of the hostages isn't always attached to that.
Right. So when you see the sort of pro-Hamas propagandists, when you see some of the resolutions that have been put forward at the Security Council, Algeria had one last week, which the United States vetoed to the president's credit. It does not make any reference to the release of hostages. It's not talking about a temporary ceasefire to allow for humanitarian relief. It is talking about an end to the conflict at current lines, which means allowing Hamas to survive the war, keeping its leadership intact. One of the primary military objectives that Israel has is not just taking territory or dismantling tunnel infrastructure or destroying the battalions that Hamas has in place, all of those important objectives. It's also hunting the leader of Hamas in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, his deputy, Mohammed Deif. It's believed that if they can find them in the tunnel system, kill them in the tunnel system, that the upper echelons of Hamas will then start to fall away. The middle level ranks of Hamas may abandon the fight, mass surrender, offers of terms for their surrender, maybe exile from Gaza in return for laying down their arms. So a lot of possibilities exist for the next stages if the Israelis are able to find and kill Sinwar and Deif soon.
Can you dive a little deeper into those possibilities for the next stages? As we sit here right now, the first day of March, we're in the fifth month of this war. Where are we in terms of that temporary ceasefire?
Yeah, so put it a little bit in perspective. March 1st, obviously coming from October 7th, the Israelis have taken operational control of most of Gaza. The north is under Israeli control, though there are pockets of Hamas cells that continue to pop up that the Israelis are fighting. We see casualties the IDF continues to take even in the north. The city of Khan Yunis, the second largest city in Gaza, which is in the south, where Yahya Sinwar is believed to be hiding and his headquarters was located, is largely under Israeli control. There's some more work to be done there. There's a lot of tunnel infrastructure to be destroyed, and there's still Sinwar to find. But then as you move south, there is Rafah that is still largely intact with Hamas battalions, four of them, it's believed, maybe other terrorists hiding underneath, maybe hostages being held underneath in the tunnels. And so that's the last major operation still to come. Okay, well, what are we up against March 1st today? 10 days from now, we're talking about the start of Ramadan, the holy month for Muslims around the world. And there is a fear that Iran and Hamas are plotting a next stage of October 7th for Ramadan. This could be some sort of combustible event at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem in hopes of spreading violence into the West Bank and to the wider region. This is something the Israelis are hoping to avoid. And so there is, alongside this negotiation for a temporary ceasefire that could allow for a hostage deal, also in the back of everyone's mind, the hope for some sort of de-escalation during Ramadan to avoid any pretext for Iran to use Ramadan, use violence in Gaza, the continued conflicts on the northern border of Israel with Hezbollah as that pretext to launch something in Al-Aqsa during Ramadan. So this is the context we're up against. The Israelis, however, their leverage in negotiations. Remember, what are they saying to Hamas? They have two objectives: free the hostages, and we're going to destroy you. Well, Hamas says, well, if I'm going to be destroyed, I'm not releasing the hostages. It's sort of obvious from a negotiating perspective. So what are incentives for Hamas right now to release hostages to get a ceasefire? Well, so long as Hamas believes it has a chance of winning the war, which to them means surviving the war, then they might agree to a ceasefire. And so for the Israeli perspective, they want a temporary ceasefire, 6 weeks at maximum, that they guarantee each other inside the government they will continue to restart operations and continue with the work of destroying Hamas in Rafah and elsewhere after that ceasefire. Hamas would be betting on international pressure over that 6 weeks being so large on Israel not to restart operations, and the 6 week ceasefire becomes a permanent ceasefire. That's the dance going on. And then other elements being, what will Hamas demand in exchange for hostages being released? In the past, we saw women being released, children being released in exchange for 3 Palestinian terrorists being released from prison on the Israeli side. And the condition the Israelis had was none of those terrorists could have had any, what they call, blood on their hands. The terrorist acts couldn't have resulted in deaths. They tried to kill people. They may have injured people, but they didn't actually kill people. Hamas is now demanding larger numbers of ratios in exchange for hostages, and they're demanding terrorists with blood on their hands be released. That's controversial inside Israel. It's part of the reason we have seen a delay in getting to a ceasefire and a hostage agreement.
I do want to talk about Qatar's involvement in all of this. You have expertise in this area. In previous conversations, you've talked about Qatar's involvement. Before, you've called them the Swiss bankers to the Nazis of the modern age. That's what you've compared them to. Where are they now in terms of being a mediator in these negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we're still stuck in October 6th when it comes to the Qataris. They are still harboring Hamas terrorists in Qatar. They still sponsor Hamas. They still defend them. Al Jazeera, which is a Qatari-sponsored news network, I'm sure most people are familiar with, is on the ground in Gaza. Their chief journalists, quote unquote, in Gaza have been exposed as terrorist operatives for Hamas. The deputy bureau chief was killed. Al Jazeera screamed bloody murder. Turned out he was a Hamas commander at the same time he was an Al Jazeera reporter and bureau chief. So we have a lot of issues here to take up with the Qataris, and we're not doing it because the Qataris still hold this over our heads saying, well, we're the only ones who talk to Hamas. We host Hamas. They're our friends, so you need us in negotiations with the hostages. That has partly shifted. The Egyptians have stepped up their role in these negotiations. Obviously, as IDF combat operations are coming closer to their border, they have taken a stronger interest in the negotiations and been more involved. The Saudis and others are looking to ensure that the Egyptians take a leading role with the Gulf states in the rebuilding of Gaza, and that Qatar is not involved. That's actually a condition the Israelis are setting down as well. But we have a lot of accountability that we need from the United States government, too, for the Qataris. Their involvement in October 7th, their support for Hamas. Will they be forced to shut down offices in Qatar? Will they be forced to turn over the leaders who lived there for extradition to the United States? Obviously, there's Americans who died on October 7th. What will happen to Al Jazeera? Will there be sanctions on Al Jazeera? Prosecution for material support for terrorism? These are the questions we should be asking. Sadly, we're still treating the Qataris like it's October 6th, like they're our friend, they're sitting at the table, and we're going to call them a neutral arbiter in these talks.
In our conversation in October, you said if you were in charge, your policy when it comes to Qatar is putting enormous pressure on them instead of what you believed or described as the United States was doing is just thanking them. As we sit here now in March, is the United States putting any type of pressure on Qatar?
At the executive branch level, I can't detect any. From Congress, we have started seeing letters out of the House and Senate threatening that they might move legislation against Qatar if Qatar doesn't use more influence to get hostages released. We've seen some bills introduced here and there from rank and file members of Congress to do things like withdraw the status that we've given Qatar as a major non-NATO ally. We are not seeing a real pressure campaign at this point. And so the Qataris do try to improve their PR. They'll invite hostage families to meet with them. They'll broker things like we saw a deal where the Israelis were going to deliver medicine to the hostages. The Qataris were going to be the guarantor. We've still not to this day ever gotten proof that the medicine arrived with the hostages, even though the Qataris claim so. But my point is that when the Qataris feel just a little bit of pressure, you do see them try to do things to evade that pressure. They are very, very protective of their image and their PR. If we were to actually have a pressure campaign on the Qataris, I think you'd have major movement within Hamas to deliver some hostages very quickly.
Well, let's say they do, Hamas and Israel rather, get to a temporary agreement. Could we expect that to be the beginning of the end of the war?
Certainly, Hamas would hope that to be the case. There are those that are supporters of Hamas that would attempt to make that happen. It's hard for me to imagine. I was just in Israel a couple of weeks ago, had meetings across the spectrum, across the political spectrum, including the defense establishment, and looking at the threat in Gaza, looking at the threat in the north. And I have to say there is unity across all areas of Israeli life, right, center, left, on completing the job in Gaza. Remember, there are more soldiers of the IDF who have fallen in battle after October 7th than there are hostages still in Gaza. And they all have family members too, and they all want their sacrifice to mean something. And so the idea that after October 7th, after the campaign that's been waged, the IDF, the Israeli leadership would say, okay, the war is over, Hamas can live to massacre another day. I don't think that is a possibility. And I think that's a little bit of a disconnect from our way of thinking in Washington right now as we look at the coverage of the ongoing conflict. Will it be a longer ceasefire? Potentially. But again, if it's over Ramadan and allows for a de-escalation to prevent any further escalation in Jerusalem or elsewhere, but does not preclude the IDF from restarting operations on the other side, it could still work to Israel's advantage.
You touched on a little bit of a disconnect here in Washington. You were on the ground in Israel just a few weeks ago, you mentioned. What do you think then is missing from the national dialogue and the international dialogue too when it comes to this war?
October 7th is like September 11th for us on steroids. I don't think anyone can imagine the Israeli psyche at this point after an event as barbaric and horrific as October 7th. And the idea that it could happen again and again, that it could happen in the north, not just on the Gaza envelope, from Hezbollah, which is a threat 10 times larger than Hamas ever was. These are questions that are lingering over every Israeli family. Kids who are trying to process what has happened, even if they were nowhere near October 7th, they still go to bed every night asking questions of their parents. Are they going to be massacred? Will there be something flown in or coming into their community? And so there is no way that Israel is going to allow Hamas to remain in any way in control in Gaza, or that its military capabilities will remain intact. And at some point, there will be a reckoning for Hezbollah in Lebanon as well, because of this same psychology and the same change in the dynamics. Also, the idea of the Palestinian Authority taking control of Gaza, the idea of a two-state solution being put up right now, so close to October 7th, is not sitting well with anyone in Israel. And that's not about Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister. It's not about cabinet ministers to his right. We're talking about when you move to the left of Netanyahu in Israel, when you move to people who are not even in the government in the left, politicians. Everyone in Israel is looking at this saying, look at the polling out of the Palestinian Authority areas. Look at the polling in the West Bank. Look at the incitement coming out of the West Bank, in the media, in the schools, from the leadership. No one has condemned October 7th from the Palestinian Authority. In fact, they celebrated it. And the population, according to polling, to the extent you can be believed, overwhelmingly supports October 7th. I mean, almost unanimously. Such high numbers. And the Israelis look at all of this after something as horrific as October 7th and say, you want us to agree to what? With who? On what terms? No, we're not going to just roll over and die. This isn't World War II. There is a state. It was built to protect the Jewish people, and that's what it's going to do. That is a major detachment from reality that we are seeing in Washington right now, where people who have been pushing a certain agenda, certain ideas for 30 years are still pushing those same ideas and are disconnected from the reality on the ground in Israel.
Let's dive a little deeper domestically. Is Israel worried at all about those 100,000 uncommitted votes that we saw in Michigan earlier this week protesting Joe Biden's Israel policy?
I don't think so. I don't speak for Israeli leaders in any way. I personally, as an American who observes this, am not worried about 100,000 committed voters, uncommitted voters. The numbers don't seem dangerously high from an electoral perspective. You compare to past elections of uncommitted votes in similar campaigns against Barack Obama and others. And you look at the choices on the ballots and how people will end up voting come election day when they have to choose between Joe Biden or Donald Trump. I think if Joe Biden has concern about Michigan, it goes much deeper than the Palestinian question to issues like cars and electric vehicles and his jobs program and the economy and things like that. And I think you see in polling from a number of swing states the same main bread and butter issues dominating over anything to do with Gaza. So no, I don't think this is the issue. Also, I think that from the Israeli perspective, they look at what's actually happening, and the Biden administration is continuing to supply weapons, is continuing military assistance, is vetoing resolutions at the Security Council. And so there's a lot of political rhetoric going on back home, and there's a different reality of support on the ground, which I think the Israelis appreciate. So that's the dynamic. So one other way to answer your question is, I think the Israelis have very little concern about 100,000 uncommitted voters in Michigan, and very high concern about 100,000 people who have been evacuated from northern Israel on the Lebanese border. That's actually the main 100,000 people that they are concerned about, because those evacuated communities are not going back to their lives in the north of Israel until the threat from Hezbollah has been abated. And today, that threat exists at a very high level, and we're seeing the daily rocket and missile attacks, UAV strikes, coming out of Lebanon from Hezbollah targeting northern Israel.
My last question to you, Richard, is what is on your radar now as we sit here, like I said, 5 months about after October 7th, that you want to remind our viewers, that you want to put on our radar?
Yeah, I think number one, remember none of this happens in silos or vacuums. So it's not that there's a war going on in Gaza. Oh, and there's something happening in Lebanon. Oh, and there might be something that happens in the West Bank or Jerusalem. Oh, and there's this thing going on in Yemen from Houthis firing missiles into the Red Sea. And oh, there's militias in Iraq and Syria. Oh, and then there's this nuclear program in Iran that we're also worried about. All of this is connected. All of these regional actors are proxies, are subsidiaries of the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is Iran's weapon of mass distraction as it is racing forward in pursuit of its weapon of mass destruction. Next week, we will see the International Atomic Energy Agency meet in Vienna to discuss Iran's nuclear program. Just as we have learned that they have expanded their nuclear stockpile even more, added one more bomb they could make in a very short amount of time based on the stockpile that they have if they further enrich uranium to weapons grade and build a bomb. This is what should be really keeping us up at night, understanding all of these fires being set are not an escalation out of Gaza. You're not worried about Israel doing something that could cause escalation in another part of the Middle East. It's not that a ceasefire in Gaza will actually make any of these threats go away or be lessened. We have to understand all the threats stem from the Islamic Republic of Iran and Tehran, and we have to keep our eyes very focused on what Iran is doing, not just in the region, but in its nuclear program as well.
If Iran is the connecting thread to all of these events, what is their ultimate goal then?
Well, their ultimate goal is regional domination, hegemony, and the export of the Islamic Revolution, not just in the Middle East, but around the globe. That is the overriding thesis of the Islamic Republic of Iran since 1979. And so when we see terrorist plots not in the Middle East, terrorist plots even on our own soil, trying to assassinate U.S. officials, kidnap Americans, we see Hezbollah operating in South America, in Europe, in Africa, elsewhere, of course in North America as well, we should assume, with a very open border, and Hezbollah operating in concert with the Mexican cartels. Iran has built an apparatus of terrorism, not just in the Middle East, but across the globe. And they are building weapons of mass destruction to be able to project power and deter the United States from any action to stop them from continuing this aggression. So we have to understand that's their doctrine. That's what they're up against. That's what they're focused on. It's their MO. And we should have a policy that confronts that. One more thing I'll let everyone know. In about 2 weeks, the Biden administration has to make a decision. Will they continue sanctions relief for Iran? There is a waiver the president has issued that comes due for renewal or expiration. It allows Iran to transact money sitting in accounts of at least $10 billion. It's already tapping it right now. We have confirmations from the Treasury Department. Will the Biden administration freeze that money, try to dry up resources for the regime? Will they renew the waiver and keep the money flowing to Tehran even while all these fires continue and the nuclear program races forward?
Richard Goldberg, per usual, insightful conversation. Thank you so much for joining me. You're welcome back anytime.
Thanks so much.